It might mess with your head a bit to realize this, but we're actually living in an ice age right now. Seriously. It started about 2.6 million years ago, and technically it hasn't ended. What's even wilder is that every 100,000 years, like clockwork, our planet goes through this insane transformation. Massive ice sheets cover huge chunks of the continents, and then they melt away again. Before we get into the science, let me tell you what this cycle actually creates. When Earth tips into a full glacial period, the planet becomes home to some of the most bizarre and magnificent creatures that have ever existed. We're talking woolly mammoths trudging through frozen grasslands, giant ground sloths digging tunnels the size of your house, and saber-toothed cats hunting prey that weighed several tons. This 100,000-year cycle literally shaped the evolution of life on Earth for millions of years. So, in this video, I'm going to break down this 100,000-year cycle, how it works, why it happens, and what kind of world it creates during the cold phases, and what happens when it shifts back to warm. You're going to meet the creatures that thrived in Ice Age conditions, learn how humans survived and adapted, and understand why it all came crashing down so recently. And at the end, we'll talk about where we are in the cycle right now and what that means for our future. Let's start with the basics. An ice age isn't just a cold period. It's an extended chunk of time, we're talking millions of years, where Earth's temperature drops enough that massive ice sheets and glaciers take over large portions of the planet's surface. And we're currently in one, the Pleistocene Ice Age, which kicked off about 2.6 million years ago and technically hasn't ended yet. Now, within any ice age, you get fluctuations. There are glacial periods where it's really frozen and interglacial periods where it warms up. We're in an interglacial period right now, have been for about 11,700 years. So when people say the Ice Age, they usually mean the last glacial period, which lasted from about 115,000 years ago to 11,700 years ago. That's when the ice sheets were at their biggest and the megafauna were running the show. During that last glacial period, the temperature was only about 6 degrees colder than today on average. 6 degrees doesn't sound like much, right? But we're not talking about 6 degrees in one spot. We're talking about 6 degrees worth of thermal energy being sucked out of the entire planet. All the oceans, all the land masses, the whole atmosphere. That's enough to completely transform the world. Huge ice sheets covered most of Canada and northern Europe. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America and the Fennoscandian ice sheet in Europe were kilometers thick in some places because so much water was locked up in ice. Sea levels dropped by over 100 meters. You could walk from England to France. You could stroll from Asia to Alaska across what's now the Bering Strait. The coastlines were completely different, and the landscape mostly tundra and cold grasslands dry and wind-swept, nothing like the forests we see today. So what caused this? Why does Earth go through these dramatic swings every 100,000 years? The answer starts with this Serbian scientist named Milutin Milankovich. This guy, back in the early 1900s, figured out something nobody else had really considered. What if ice ages weren't caused by anything happening on Earth, but by changes in Earth's position relative to the Sun? See, Earth's orbit isn't perfectly circular, it's slightly elliptical, and the shape of that ellipse changes over time because of gravitational pulls from other planets, mainly Jupiter and Saturn. Sometimes our orbit is more circular, sometimes it's more stretched out. And this cycle of changing from circular to elliptical and back takes about 100,000 years. That's the first Milankovich cycle, called eccentricity. When Earth's orbit is highly elliptical, the distance between Earth and the Sun varies more dramatically throughout the year. This affects how much solar radiation hits different parts of the planet at different times. And here's the crucial part. It's not about how much total sunlight Earth gets, it's about where and when that sunlight hits. Northern Hemisphere summers are the key, because that's where most of the land is. If Northern Hemisphere summers are cool enough that winter snow doesn't fully melt, the snow sticks around. Year after year, it piles up. Eventually, you've got ice sheets forming, and once ice sheets start growing, they reflect more sunlight back into space, which cools things down even more, which allows more ice to form. It's a runaway feedback loop. But eccentricity isn't the only cycle. There's also obliquity, which is the tilt of Earth's axis. The more tilted Earth is, the more extreme the seasons. This tilt varies on a roughly 41,000-year cycle. When Earth is less tilted, the difference between summer and winter is milder, which means summer might not be warm enough to melt all the winter ice. Ice accumulates, ice age begins. The third cycle is precession or wobble. Earth wobbles on its axis I find myself endlessly fascinated by the Earth's climate cycles, these slow, almost imperceptible shifts that dictate so much. It's humbling to think that the tilt of our planet, like a spinning top starting to slow, influences which hemisphere leans toward the sun, creating a 26,000-year cycle that shapes the contrast between seasons. Right now, the northern hemisphere experiences winter when Earth is closest to the sun, resulting in milder winters. But that wasn't always the case, and it won't always be. When eccentricity, obliquity, and precession combine, they orchestrate Earth's long-term climate in ways we're still trying to fully understand. The oddest part? The 100,000-year eccentricity cycle is the weakest of the three in terms of changing incoming solar radiation. The other two cycles, in theory, should matter more. Yet, when scientists analyzed ocean sediment and ice core samples to reconstruct past climates, they found that the dominant pattern was, undeniably, 100,000 years. This discrepancy is known as the 100,000-year problem, and it continues to challenge scientists. The leading explanation involves feedback mechanisms that amplify the eccentricity cycle. Perhaps ice sheets take a long time to form but collapse quickly. The system spends most of its time slowly accumulating ice during cool phases, then rapidly melting when conditions warm. This asymmetry might explain why the 100,000-year pattern is so prominent. What we know for certain is that for the past million years, Earth has undergone these 100,000-year climate cycles. A gradual buildup of ice over tens of thousands of years, followed by relatively rapid melting, and then another slow accumulation. And during these cold phases, the world became a stage for the most incredible animals ever to walk the planet, the Megafauna. The word mega is no exaggeration. Some of these creatures weighed 4,500 kilograms or more. There are theories about why everything grew so large during ice ages. One idea is Bergmann's rule, which suggests that in cold climates, mammals tend to be larger because a bigger body has a lower surface area to volume ratio. Less surface area relative to volume means less heat loss, helping larger bodies stay warmer in the cold. That's why polar bears are bigger than other bear species, and why Ice Age mammals tended toward the gigantic. But size alone doesn't tell the whole story. These animals had incredible adaptations for surviving in a frozen world. The most famous example, the poster child of the Ice Age, is the woolly mammoth. Woolly mammoths weren't actually as huge as you might think. They were about the same size as modern elephants, maybe a bit shorter, but they were built completely differently. They had thick, shaggy fur with two layers, a dense underwool, and longer outer guard hairs. This coat could be up to a meter long in places, providing insulation so effective that mammoths could handle temperatures of 40 degrees or colder. They also had small ears to minimize heat loss, unlike modern elephants with their big floppy ears used for cooling off. And they had a layer of fat up to 9 millimeters thick for extra insulation and energy storage. Their skulls were specially shaped too, with large sinus cavities that helped warm and humidify the cold, dry air before it reached their lungs. Breathing in super cold air can damage your lungs, so this was a crucial adaptation. And their teeth were perfect for grinding the tough grasses and sedges that grew on the mammoth steppe, this unique cold grassland ecosystem that covered huge areas during glacial periods. As their teeth wore down, new ones would move forward from the back of the jaw. A mammoth would go through 6 sets of teeth in its lifetime. We know so much about mammoths because some have been found frozen in permafrost, almost perfectly preserved with fur, skin, and even stomach contents intact. Scientists have studied what they ate, extracted their DNA, and found that they had special hemoglobin variants that worked better in the cold, allowing their blood to deliver oxygen more efficiently in freezing temperatures. These animals were fine-tuned for Ice Age conditions. But mammoths weren't alone. The Ice Age world was packed with megafauna. Woolly rhinoceroses roamed the same landscapes, covered in thick fur with massive horns that could reach over a meter long. They used these horns to plow through snow to reach vegetation underneath. Giant ground sloths lived in the Americas, and these weren't the cute little tree sloths we know today. Some species weighed several tons and could stand up to 4 meters tall on their hind legs. They were too big to climb trees, so they lived on the ground, feeding on vegetation and, incredibly, digging burrows. We've found their burrows, tunnels up to 40 meters long with claw marks on the walls that match their fossilized claws perfectly. There were glyptodonts, basically car-sized armadillos with shells made of fused bone plates. They couldn't roll up like modern armadillos, but they didn't need to. Their shells were tough enough to stop most predators, and some species had club-like tails covered in bony spikes that they could swing as weapons. Recent studies suggest they might have been able to rear up on their hind legs, which means you could have had these armored tanks standing upright and swinging spiked clubs. That's both awesome and terrifying. And then there were the predators. Saber-toothed cats prowled the Americas with canine teeth up to 18 centimeters long, curved like daggers. They used these to deliver killing bites to the throat or belly of prey, causing massive bleeding. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern lions. Giant short-faced bears in North America might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever, standing over 3 meters tall on their hind legs. Dire wolves hunted in packs and had more powerful jaws. I've always been drawn to the moments when the world shifts, when the familiar gives way to something utterly different. Imagine a world dominated by giants, mammoths, woolly rhinos, and ground sloths dwarfing even elephants. A frozen planet, sculpted by a 100,000-year cycle of ice and thaw. For hundreds of millennia, this cycle repeated, ice sheets expanding, then retreating. But about 11,700 years ago, something changed. The ice melted as before, but this time, the giants didn't survive. What happened during one of these cycles? What did the planet look like at its coldest? How did these creatures endure? And what triggered the shift that ultimately led to their demise? Let's journey back about 20,000 years to the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age. The world was utterly transformed. Ice sheets blanketed Canada, reaching deep into the northern United States, in some places reaching a thickness of 3 kilometers. Imagine stacking the Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building, more than 3 times. But instead of steel and glass, it's solid ice covering an area the size of a continent. The weight of all that ice was so immense that it pressed down on the Earth's crust, deforming the very rock beneath. Europe had its own massive ice sheet, blanketing Scandinavia, the Baltic, parts of Britain, and northern Russia. In total, we're looking at perhaps 15 million cubic kilometers of ice sitting on land. If you were to spread that evenly across the Earth's land surface, it would be about 100 meters deep everywhere. It's an almost incomprehensible amount of water, frozen solid. With so much water locked away, sea levels plummeted by 120 meters, the height of a 40-story building. Coastlines extended far beyond their present locations. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain was connected to mainland Europe. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. Indonesia, now a collection of islands, was a single land mass connected to Asia. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed one giant continent. And between Alaska and Siberia, a vast grassy plain called Beringia emerged where the Bering Strait now lies. The world map was unrecognizable, but the changes weren't just geographical. The climate was drastically different. It wasn't merely colder, it was much drier. With so much water trapped in ice and lower ocean temperatures reducing evaporation, the atmosphere held less moisture. Deserts expanded and rainforests shrank. The Amazon basin was likely a mix of grassland and scattered trees. The Sahara was even larger than it is today. Much of the world was covered in tundra or cold, dry grasslands with few trees. The ice sheets acted as giant refrigerators, generating cold, dense air that flowed off in powerful winds. These winds picked up dust and silt from the exposed ground, carrying it hundreds, even thousands of kilometers. In some parts of China, dust deposits accumulated to over 100 meters thick during glacial periods. The dust storms must have been incredible, blotting out the sun for days. This was the world at peak glaciation, harsh, cold, dry, and windswept. And yet, life didn't just survive, it thrived. The megafauna weren't simply scraping by. They dominated these ecosystems, existing in numbers that likely matched or exceeded the density of large animals in Africa today. The mammoth steppe was the dominant ecosystem across vast stretches of the northern hemisphere. This unique grassland, a mix of grasses, sedges, herbs, and low shrubs adapted to cold, dry conditions, supported enormous populations of large herbivores, mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, all grazing together in immense herds. What a sight that must have been. Mammoths are the most iconic, but they weren't alone. Woolly rhinoceroses were just as impressive, similar in size to modern rhinos, but built for the cold. They had thick woolly coats and two horns, the front one sometimes exceeding a meter in length. They used these horns to clear snow and reach the vegetation beneath. We found woolly rhinos preserved in permafrost, just like mammoths, with their fur and soft tissue intact. Like mammoths, they show clear adaptations to extreme cold, including small ears and thick layers of fat. Giant ground sloths dominated the Americas. Modern sloths are slow-moving creatures that hang in rainforest trees, but Ice Age ground sloths were vastly different. The largest species, Megatherium americanum, weighed an estimated 3,800 kilograms, heavier than most elephants. They could stand on their hind legs, reaching heights of 4 meters or more. These were elephant-sized sloths, too big to climb trees, living on the ground and feeding on vegetation. And here's where it gets interesting. We've found their burrows, actual tunnels dug into hillsides, some 40 meters long and nearly 2 meters wide. The walls. I sometimes imagine encountering a multi-ton sloth emerging from an underground tunnel. It sounds made up, doesn't it? But these creatures were real. Ceilings of some burrows show claw marks that match perfectly with ground sloth claws. Scientists believe they dug these burrows either to escape temperature extremes or to hide from predators. Gypodons were another bizarre group from that era. They were relatives of modern armadillos, but scaled up to ridiculous proportions. These giants weighed up to 2 tons and walked on elephant-sized legs. Their bodies were protected by shells made of hundreds of bony plates fused together, much like a turtle, but far larger and heavier. The shells could be over 1.5 meters long, tough enough to stop almost any predator. Some gypodont species even had tails covered in bony rings with spikes on the end, essentially a medieval mace attached to their body. Recent biomechanical studies suggest they could rear up on their hind legs, meaning these armored tanks could stand upright and swing their spiked tails as weapons. The diversity of megafauna during the Ice Age is truly staggering. In North America alone, there were mammoths, mastodons, a different family of proboscideans with different tooth structures, American horses, American camels, giant beavers the size of bears, stag moose with enormous antlers, and multiple species of giant ground sloths. South America had even more ground sloth species, glyptodons, giant armadillos, toxodons, which were kind of like hippo-sized rodent relatives, and macrokinia, which looked like a strange cross between a camel and a small elephant with a trunk. In Eurasia, you had mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, steppe bison, giant deer called megaloceros, with antlers spanning over 3.5 meters and more. And then, of course, there were the predators. Wherever you have large herbivores, you have large carnivores hunting them. Saber-toothed cats are probably the most famous Ice Age predator. Smilodon in the Americas had those incredible canine teeth, up to 18 centimeters long and flattened like blades. These weren't for crushing bone or gripping, they were precision killing tools. Saber-tooths would use their powerful forelimbs to wrestle prey to the ground, then deliver a killing bite to the throat or belly, severing major blood vessels and causing rapid death from blood loss. The La Brea tar pits in California have preserved thousands of Ice Age animal bones, and saber-tooths are among the most common carnivores found there. This tells us they were successful predators, probably living in social groups like modern lions. And their prey wasn't small. They were taking down bison, young mammoths, horses, and giant ground sloths, big, dangerous animals. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern African lions and probably hunted similar prey. Cave bears, despite the scary name, were mostly herbivorous, but they were huge, up to half a ton, and their size alone made them formidable. And then there were giant short-faced bears in North America, which might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever to exist. These bears stood over 3 meters tall on their hind legs and may have weighed up to 800 kilograms. There's debate about whether they were active predators or scavengers, but either way, you definitely didn't want to run into one. Dire wolves were another major predator, especially in the Americas. Real dire wolves, not the fantasy version. They were larger and more heavily built than modern gray wolves, with more powerful jaws designed for crushing bone. They hunted in packs and could take down prey much larger than themselves through coordinated attacks. The La Brea tar pits have yielded thousands of dire wolf fossils, more than any other carnivore, which suggests they were incredibly common. Even birds got in on the megafauna action. Teratorns were some of the largest flying birds ever, with wingspans over 3.5 meters. They probably soared on thermals like modern condors searching for carrion. And there were even larger flightless birds in some regions. The Ice Age world had no shortage of impressive and terrifying predators. But here's what's really fascinating. All of these animals, from the smallest ground squirrels to the largest mammoths, were part of functioning ecosystems. They weren't just wandering around randomly. They had complex relationships with each other and with their environment. Herbivores competed for food and space. Predators hunted herbivores. Scavengers cleaned up the remains. And plants evolved to withstand grazing prey. It was all interconnected, and the megafauna themselves were ecosystem engineers. Mammoths, for example, didn't just eat grass. They knocked down trees, creating and maintaining open grasslands. They distributed nutrients across the landscape through their dung. They created trails and wallows. Their actions shaped the entire ecosystem. When you have animals that weigh several tons moving through an environment, they have a huge impact. Scientists have reconstructed these ancient ecosystems using multiple lines of evidence. Fossil assemblages tell us which animals live together in the same places. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth tells us what they ate and what the climate was like. Ancient DNA can be extracted from permafrost sediments, even from sediments with no visible fossils. And this tells us which species were present. Cave paintings created by humans show what animals looked like and how they behaved. By combining all this evidence, we can paint a pretty detailed picture of Ice Age life. One thing that's become clear is that these ecosystems weren't static. They changed and shifted as the climate fluctuated. Remember, even within a glacial period, there were shorter-term climate variations. Events called Dansgaard Oeschger oscillations caused rapid warming spikes lasting decades to centuries, then rapid cooling again. Standing at the last glacial maximum, looking out over a landscape of ice sheets and cold grasslands with mammoths and rhinos and giant sloths moving through it, you'd be witnessing something that will probably never exist again. These ecosystems are gone now. The megafauna are extinct. It's a lost world. I've been reading about how, for hundreds of thousands of years, this pattern repeated: cold phase, megafauna thrive; warm phase, forests expand; cold phase again, megafauna come back. It was a rhythm that life on Earth had adapted to. These temperature swings affected where animals could live, what vegetation grew, and which species thrived versus struggled. The Ice Age world was dynamic, constantly responding to climate changes on multiple timescales. Humans were part of this world too. Our ancestors lived alongside these megafauna. Some of them hunted, competed with predators for resources, and adapted their own technology and culture to survive in glacial conditions. In Europe, Neanderthals had been living through these cycles for hundreds of thousands of years. They were cold-adapted with stocky builds, large nasal cavities to warm air, and sophisticated tools. They hunted megafauna, made complex weapons, used fire effectively, and even had symbolic culture with art and burial rituals. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago. They brought new technologies, more complex social structures, and wider trade networks. They overlapped with Neanderthals for thousands of years, sharing the landscape and the megafauna. In fact, we now know from genetic evidence that they interbred. Most people of European or Asian descent carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. In other parts of the world, modern humans were also adapting to Ice Age conditions and living alongside megafauna in Asia, in Australia, which humans reached at least 65,000 years ago, and eventually in the Americas. The interaction between humans and megafauna is one of the most debated topics in Ice Age research. About 19,000 years ago, something started to shift. The orbital cycles were moving into a configuration that favored warming. Northern Hemisphere summers were getting stronger. The ice sheets began to melt, and what happened next would change everything. The transition from the last glacial period to our current interglacial was one of the most dramatic climate changes in recent Earth history. And caught in the middle of that transition were all these megafauna that had evolved to thrive in a frozen world. Most of them wouldn't make it through. So, we've talked about what these Ice Age giants looked like. But let's get into the details of how they actually lived, because the more we learn about these animals, the more incredible they become. Some of the discoveries are genuinely surprising. Let's start with something that sounds impossible. Giant ground sloths digging massive burrows. When scientists first found these tunnels in South America, particularly in Argentina near Mar del Plata, they weren't what made them. The burrows were huge, some reaching 5 to 6 meters below the surface, up to 1.8 meters wide and 40 meters long. That's a 2-story house worth of tunnel underground. Multiple mammal species were considered as possible diggers. But the evidence kept pointing to ground sloths, specifically species like Glosstherium and Silithrium. The first clue was their arm bones. Ground sloth forelimbs were designed in a shovel-like structure with unusually long second and third fingers, perfect for digging. And the bones were super strong, designed to withstand the kind of bending forces you'd get from digging through hard soil, similar to the stresses that galloping mammals put on their leg bones. The second clue, their center of gravity. Paleontologists estimated from the skeleton that ground sloths had their center of gravity above their hind feet, which means they could rear up into a bipedal posture. This is crucial for digging because your arms need to be free to excavate, not supporting your body weight. You can't dig effectively if you're on all fours. And the final smoking gun, claw marks on the walls and ceilings of the burrows, perfectly preserved in the fossilized tunnels. Scientists matched these marks to ground sloth hand skeletons, and they fit exactly. These sloths weren't just big. They were engineering huge underground structures for animals weighing 800 to 1,200 kilograms. This is incredible behavior. Why were they doing it? The leading theories are either temperature regulation or predator avoidance. Underground, temperatures are much more stable than on the surface. If you're trying to escape extreme heat or cold, a burrow makes sense. Or maybe they were hiding from predators like saber-toothed cats or giant short-faced bears. When you're big but not fast, going underground where predators can't easily follow you is a smart strategy. Either way, it shows these animals were way more behaviorally complex than we might expect from something called a giant sloth. Here's another fascinating discovery about ground sloths. In Ecuador, at a site called Tank Loma, paleontologists found the remains of at least 22 Aromatherium sloths of various ages, all in the same location. They likely died during a drought, getting trapped in a shrinking watering hole. But the cool part is what this tells us about their behavior. They were congregating at watering holes, which means they were social animals living in groups. And they were probably wallowing in the water to escape heat and insects, similar to how hippos and rhinos behave today. Wait, the last mammoths. It's a thought that stays with me. They lived on Wrangler Island in the Arctic Ocean, cut off from the mainland as the ice sheets melted. A population of around 500 to 1,000 of these giants survived there in isolation until about 4,000 years ago. Imagine it, 4,000 years ago, the pyramids of Giza were already standing. The Bronze Age was well underway. Mammoths and ancient civilizations overlapped in time. The last of these giants was still walking around on a remote Arctic island, while humans in Egypt were building monuments and developing writing. Even during ice ages, not everywhere was frozen. Tropical and subtropical regions still had warm seasons. The climate was cooler and drier than today, but equatorial regions weren't under ice sheets. Animals living in these areas still needed ways to deal with heat stress during the warmest parts of the year. Ground sloths in South America, for instance, used strategies that large African mammals use today. The Ice Age wasn't uniformly frozen across the entire planet. And speaking of mammoths, the ones preserved in Siberian permafrost have given us an incredible amount of information. Some of these frozen mammoths even have their last meals preserved in their stomachs. Scientists have examined this material and found grasses, sedges, herbs, flowers, and mosses. This tells us exactly what the mammoth steppe ecosystem was like and what plants were available. We've extracted DNA from these frozen specimens and sequenced entire mammoth genomes. The genetic analysis revealed some fascinating adaptations. Mammoths had variants of hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in blood, that functioned better at cold temperatures. Normal hemoglobin doesn't release oxygen as efficiently when it's cold, a problem for an animal in freezing conditions. Mammoth hemoglobin had mutations that compensated for this, allowing their blood to deliver oxygen effectively even when their body tissues were cold. We've also found that mammoths had genes for small ears, sparse sweat glands, and improved fat storage, all coded in their DNA. Evolution didn't just change their external appearance, it rewired their physiology at the genetic level. But back to those last mammoths on Wrangler Island. They eventually went extinct, probably due to a combination of inbreeding, habitat degradation on their small island, and possibly climate change or human arrival. The end of an evolutionary line that had lasted for millions of years. Woolly rhinoceroses are another species we know a lot about from frozen specimens. Like mammoths, they had thick woolly coats and were built for the cold. But their behavior was probably different based on their tooth wear and the isotopes in their bones. Scientists think woolly rhinos were more selective feeders than mammoths. While mammoths were bulk grazers, eating lots of whatever vegetation was available, woolly rhinos seemed to be pickier, probably using their horns to dig through snow to find specific plants they preferred. Then there's the giant deer, Megaloceros, with antlers that were absolutely insane. The largest specimens had antlers spanning over 3.5 meters from tip to tip, wider than a car. These antlers could weigh up to 40 kilograms. Carrying that much weight on your head takes serious neck and shoulder muscles. Scientists think these massive antlers were primarily for display and competition between males, similar to how modern deer use their antlers. During mating season, males would show off their antlers to females and use them in battles with rival males. The bigger your antlers, the more impressive you looked. But those antlers came with a cost. Growing them required huge amounts of calcium and energy, and carrying them around was energetically expensive. Only the healthiest, best-fed males could support truly enormous antlers. Cave bears are interesting because, despite their name and their size, they were mostly herbivorous. Isotope analysis of their bones shows they ate primarily plants. They were built like grizzly bears but acted more like giant pandas. They hibernated in caves during winter, which is where we find most of their fossils. Some caves in Europe have thousands of cave bear bones, representing hundreds or thousands of individuals that hibernated there over millennia. Cave bears went extinct earlier than many other megafauna, around 27,000 to 24,000 years ago, well before the end of the last glacial period. The reasons aren't entirely clear, but it might have been related to competition with humans for cave space, climate changes affecting their food supply, or a combination of factors. And then there are glyptodons. The more I learn about them, the more they blow my mind. Recent studies of their skeletal structure and muscle attachment points suggest they were capable of some surprising behaviors. They might have been able to rear up, as we discussed earlier, but they also show adaptations for powerful digging. similar to what we see in modern armadillos, but scaled up massively. These armored giants might have dug burrows like their ground sloth contemporaries. Imagine tunnels big enough for a Volkswagen Beetle to drive through, created by armored animals with spiky tails. The Ice Age was wild, and the predators of the Ice Age were just as specialized as the herbivores. Saber-toothed cats didn't just have those impressive fangs for show. Biomechanical studies of their skulls show they had relatively weak bite forces compared to modern big cats. But their neck muscles were incredibly powerful. The hunting strategy was probably to use their strong forelimbs to wrestle prey down, then use their neck muscles to drive those saber teeth deep into the prey's throat or belly with precision. It wasn't about crushing force, but about precision. The dire wolf. I've spent years studying its fossil record, and what always strikes me is how many broken teeth, healed fractures, and signs of arthritis we find, especially in older individuals. It paints a picture of a life lived in a pack where even the injured and elderly were cared for. A wolf with a broken leg simply can't hunt alone. But if the pack shares food, it survives. The evidence suggests dire wolves had complex social structures, much like modern wolves. Giant short-faced bears, on the other hand, remain more mysterious. Were they predators or scavengers? The evidence is mixed. Their long legs suggest they could cover vast distances efficiently, perfect for scavenging. But their powerful jaws and teeth certainly could kill prey. Perhaps they were opportunistic, hunting when they could and scavenging when necessary. Their sheer size, potentially the largest mammalian land predator ever, suggests they could intimidate smaller predators and steal their kills. I can almost picture it. A pack of dire wolves bringing down a bison only to have a giant short-faced bear appear and chase them off to claim the carcass. One of the coolest things about Ice Age ecosystems to me is how we can reconstruct them from an unusual source: ancient DNA in sediments. Even without bones or visible fossils, animal DNA can be preserved in frozen soil. Scientists have developed techniques to extract and identify this environmental DNA. It reveals which species were present in different places at different times. It's filled in so many gaps in the fossil record, showing us that Ice Age ecosystems were even more diverse than we ever realized. For instance, we now know that horses were present in areas where we have no horse fossils, simply because we found horse DNA in the soil. We've even identified plants that grew in certain regions by finding their pollen and DNA. We can even tell what the climate was like by looking at which species of plants and insects were present. It's like reading an ancient ecological record written in genetic code. Humans, of course, observed and interacted with all this megafauna, and they left records of what they saw. Cave art from sites like Lascaux in France and Chauvet Cave shows remarkably accurate depictions of Ice Age animals. The artists painted mammoths, woolly rhinos, bison, horses, cave lions, and more. These paintings aren't crude stick figures. They're sophisticated artworks showing animals in motion, even using the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. The artists clearly spent a lot of time observing these animals to capture them so accurately. Some cave paintings even show details like fur patterns, seasonal coat changes, and behavioral poses. There's a famous painting of a woolly rhino that clearly shows its thick fur and the way it held its head. There are paintings of mammoths that show their characteristic domed heads and long tusks. These artworks are our direct visual record of what Ice Age megafauna looked like, created by people who saw them alive. Humans also left behind butchered animal bones showing clear-cut marks from stone tools, mammoth bones with spear points embedded in them, campsites with hearths surrounded by the remains of horses, bison, and reindeer. The archaeological record proves that humans hunted megafauna and relied on them for food, materials for tools and clothing, and fat for fuel. Mammoth ivory was carved into art objects and tools. Hides were used for clothing and shelter. Bones were used to build dwelling structures in areas with scarce wood. Every part of these animals was utilized. But humans weren't just passive observers or simple hunters. There's evidence that humans might have used fire to manage landscapes, creating and maintaining the open grasslands that megafauna depended on. By burning vegetation regularly, humans could prevent forests from encroaching on grasslands, keeping habitats open for the large herbivores they hunted. This kind of ecosystem engineering might have actually helped support megafauna populations in some regions. The relationship between humans and megafauna was complex, not just predator and prey. The 100,000-year cycle had created this entire world. The cold phase of the cycle produced these unique ecosystems and drove the evolution of specialized megafauna adapted to frozen conditions. For hundreds of thousands of years, the pattern repeated. Ice sheets advanced. Megafauna thrived. Ice sheets retreated. Forests expanded. Ice sheets advanced again. Life adapted to this rhythm. But then, about 19,000 years ago, the cycle began shifting toward warming again. And this time, something was different. This time, humans had spread across most of the world, developed sophisticated hunting technologies, and existed in larger numbers than ever before. This time, when the climate started changing and the ice began to melt, the megafauna wouldn't just adapt and wait for the cycle to swing back to cold like they had for hundreds of thousands of years. This time, most of them were going to disappear forever, and we're still debating exactly why. So, around 19,000 years ago, the 100,000-year cycle reached a turning point. The orbital configuration shifted into a pattern that favored warming. Northern Hemisphere summers started getting stronger, receiving more solar radiation, and when that happens, winter snow starts melting more completely each summer. Ice sheets stop growing and begin their long retreat. The transition from glacial to interglacial conditions was underway. Deglaciation is never a smooth process. It's a series of fits and starts, sudden collapses, temporary reversals, and periods of rapid change that our ancestors would have witnessed within their lifetimes. This very messiness is what makes understanding the extinction of the megafauna so complicated. The first major pulse of melting began around 19,000 years ago and continued for several millennia. As ice sheets melted, pouring water back into the oceans, sea levels began to rise. During one period, around 1,400 years ago, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, sea levels rose by roughly 20 meters in less than 500 years. 20 meters may not sound enormous, but that's enough to flood vast coastal areas, submerge land bridges, and completely transform coastlines. All that water had to come from somewhere. It came from collapsing sections of the great ice sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet, That massive dome of ice covering Canada began breaking apart, as did the Fennoscandian ice sheet in Europe. As they melted, they left behind a landscape that had been compressed under kilometers of ice for thousands of years. The land was scraped clean, covered in glacial till, dotted with lakes formed in depressions carved by ice. I imagine it must have been a raw, bare landscape at first, slowly being colonized by plants as the climate warmed. But the warming wasn't steady. There were dramatic interruptions, the most famous being the Younger Dryas event. By around 14 to 700 years ago, the world had been warming for thousands of years. Ice sheets were in retreat. Things seemed to be heading toward interglacial conditions. Then suddenly, temperatures crashed. In Greenland, temperatures dropped by about 15 degrees Celsius in just a few decades, possibly even faster. Some evidence suggests it could have happened in as little as 10 to 20 years. The North Atlantic region was plunged back into near-glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. The leading theory involves a catastrophic flood. As the Laurentide ice sheet melted, water pooled up behind it, forming enormous glacial lakes. The largest was Glacial Lake Agassiz, which was bigger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. This lake was dammed in by the ice sheet itself, and when that ice dam failed, geological evidence suggests it did multiple times. Stupendous amounts of fresh water flooded into the ocean in a geologically instant time frame. We're talking about enough water to raise global sea levels by several meters, all released in months to years. This massive freshwater dump disrupted ocean circulation in the North Atlantic. There's an ocean circulation pattern called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. It's basically a conveyor belt where warm surface water flows north, cools down near Greenland, becomes dense and sinks, then flows south at depth. This circulation transports enormous amounts of heat from the tropics to the northern hemisphere, but fresh water is less dense than salt water. When you dump a huge amount of fresh water into the North Atlantic, it floats on top and prevents the normal sinking of cold, dense water. This can slow down or shut down the AMOC. When the AMOC stops, the northern hemisphere stops receiving that massive heat transport from the tropics, temperatures crash, and you're back to near glacial conditions. The Younger Dryas had effects far beyond the North Atlantic. Climate patterns shifted across the globe. Some regions got drier, others wetter, temperatures changed, and this had huge impacts on ecosystems and the animals living in them. For megafauna that were already stressed by changing habitats as the climate warmed and forests expanded, the Younger Dryas cold snap might have provided a temporary reprieve, but it also added instability to an already unstable situation. It also had major impacts on human societies. In the Middle East, this is right around the time agriculture first developed. Some scientists think the climate stress of the Younger Dryas might have pushed hunter-gatherer groups to start deliberately cultivating plants as a way to end food security when wild resources became unreliable. If that's true, then this climate event, triggered by the 100,000-year cycle transitioning from glacial to interglacial, literally changed the course of human history, setting us on the path to farming, settled civilizations, and everything that followed. Eventually, around 11,700 years ago, The Younger Dryas ended just as abruptly as it started. Temperatures spiked upward again. In some regions, temperatures rose by 10 degrees Celsius or more in just a decade or two. That's mind-bogglingly fast for natural climate change. The Sea kicked back into gear. Heat flooded northward again. Ice sheets resumed their collapse. And this time, there was no going back. The transition to full interglacial conditions was complete. We call this the beginning of the Holocene, our current geological epoch, and it marks the end of the last glacial period. For the megafauna, this was catastrophic. They had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to thrive in cold, open grassland environments. But as the Holocene began, those environments were disappearing. The mammoth steppe, that unique ecosystem of cold grasslands that had supported enormous populations of large herbivores, was transforming. Forests were expanding. Grasslands were shrinking. The climate was getting wetter and warmer. For animals adapted to cold and dry conditions, this was a crisis. The extinctions came fast. In North America, most megafauna disappeared between about 13,000 and 11,000 years ago. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant short-faced bears, all gone within a few thousand years. That's 70 to 80% of large mammal species just vanished. I think about the quaternary extinction event often. It was devastating. Across the world, giant creatures vanished. Europe lost its woolly rhinos and cave lions. The giant deer disappeared, and the woolly mammoths retreated to isolated places like Wrangler Island. The megapora that had dominated the Ice Age were gone, or severely reduced. South America suffered similar losses. The giant ground sloths, the glyptodonts, the native horses and camels, the toxodons, the macrokinia, and the giant armadillos, all extinct. It was as if an extinction wave swept through the Americas like wildfire. Australia had already lost most of its megapora earlier, somewhere between 50 and 40,000 years ago. Giant wombats, enormous kangaroos, massive flightless birds, even a marsupial lion, all disappeared. The timing in Australia seems to coincide more with the arrival of humans than with the last deglaciation. This adds another piece to the puzzle. What killed them? That's the question that's been debated for decades, and honestly, it's still not completely settled. There are two main schools of thought: the climate change hypothesis and the human hunting hypothesis. The truth, I suspect, is probably a combination of both, with the relative importance varying by region and species. The climate change hypothesis argues that the rapid warming and ecosystem transformation was more than these animals could handle. Megapora had evolved for cold, open habitats. When those habitats disappeared in just a few thousand years, they couldn't adapt quickly enough. As forests expanded and grassland shrank, megapora populations became fragmented into smaller and smaller pockets of suitable habitat. And small isolated populations are vulnerable to inbreeding, disease, and random environmental fluctuations. This creates an extinction vortex where declining populations face multiple threats that compound each other, and recovery becomes impossible. There's good evidence for climate being a major factor. The extinctions happened during a period of incredibly rapid climate change. Species adapted to cold climates, like woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos, went extinct, while species adapted to forests or warmer climates generally survived. This pattern certainly suggests climate played a big role. Also, Megapora had survived previous deglaciations. The 100,000-year cycle means there were multiple transitions from glacial to interglacial conditions over the past few million years. If Megapora survived those, why not this one? That's where the human hunting hypothesis comes in. Modern humans had spread across most of the world by the end of the last ice age. And humans are incredibly effective hunters, especially with the technological innovations that developed during this period. Atlatls, spear throwers that dramatically extend your range and power, sophisticated hunting strategies involving coordinated groups, and later, bows and arrows. Human populations were growing and spreading into new territories. Critically, many Megapora had little or no evolutionary experience with human hunters when humans first arrived in the Americas or Australia. The local Megapora hadn't evolved fear responses to these two-legged predators. They were, in essence, naive prey. Modern examples show this pattern clearly. When humans first reached oceanic islands with no previous human presence, the native birds and mammals often showed no fear and were easily hunted to extinction within decades or centuries. The same might have happened with Ice Age Megapora. They simply didn't recognize humans as threats until it was too late. And here's the thing about hunting Megapora. You don't need to hunt intensively to drive them extinct. These animals have slow reproductive rates. A female mammoth might have a calf every 5 years. Mammoths don't reach sexual maturity until they're teens. If you kill even a few individuals per year from a population, especially females of reproductive age, you can drive the population into decline. Mathematical models show that even very low-intensity hunting, killing just a few % of the population per year, can drive large-bodied animals extinct over centuries to millennia. And we know humans hunted Megapora. We've found butchered mammoth bones at human sites, spear points embedded in mammoth ribs, kill sites where multiple animals were driven off cliffs or into traps and then butchered, cave paintings showing hunting scenes. The evidence is undeniable that humans hunted these animals. The question is whether hunting alone could cause extinctions, or whether it was just the final straw for populations already struggling with climate change. The timing is really suspicious in many regions. In North America, the extinctions coincide almost exactly with the expansion of Clovis culture, a group of humans with particularly effective hunting technology. Clovis points, these distinctive spear points, are found at sites with butchered mammoth remains. Within a few thousand years of Clovis people spreading across North America, the Megapora were gone. That's awfully coincidental timing. A study of the Anzac child, the only known Clovis individual, provides some interesting evidence. This was an 18-month-old child buried about 12,700 years ago in Montana. Scientists analyzed isotopes from the bones to reconstruct the diet of the child's mother. And they found that mammoth contributed around 40% of the maternal protein diet, similar to the diet of specialized mammoth predators, like scimitar cats. This suggests Clovis people were heavily targeting mammoths, possibly as specialized mammoth hunters. But we need to be careful not to overinterpret. The Anzac child is one individual We can't say all Clovis people had the same diet or hunting focus. The disappearance of the Ice Age giants is still a puzzle to me. We know that small populations of humans existed then, but did they really hunt mammoths to extinction across an entire continent? Some scientists remain skeptical, and I understand why. The extinction pattern itself is so varied. Some species vanished early, while others held on much longer. Take the mammoths on Wrangel Island, for example. They survived until about 4,000 years ago, thousands of years after their mainland cousins disappeared. And then you have cave bears, gone even before many other species. Dire wolves vanished, yet gray wolves survived. Bison, despite being heavily hunted, also made it. Why some species survived and others didn't is still being unraveled. What seems clear is that the combination of climate change and human press proved deadly. Climate change stressed the megafauna, fragmenting their habitats and reducing their food. Human hunting then prevented these already struggling populations from recovering. A perfect storm, really, that most megafauna simply couldn't weather. And there may have been indirect effects we still don't fully grasp. Humans extensively used fire to manage landscapes, altering vegetation patterns. The loss of the megafauna themselves also had profound ecosystem effects. Mammoths and other large herbivores acted as ecosystem engineers, maintaining open grasslands. When they disappeared, those grasslands transformed into forests, making the habitat even less suitable for any remaining megafauna. It was a cascade of interconnected effects. What we're left with is this: the 100,000-year cycle that had sustained the megafauna for hundreds of thousands of years. Cold phase, they thrived. Warm phase, they retreated to refugia. Cold phase again, they expanded, a rhythm that life had adapted to. But this time, when the cycle shifted to warming, there was a new factor: humans, with sophisticated hunting technology and growing populations. The combination of rapid climate change and human press was more than most megafauna could handle, and within a few thousand years, the Ice Age world of giants was gone forever. Now, let's turn to the humans who lived through these 100,000-year cycles, because their story is just as fascinating as that of the megafauna. And when I say humans, I'm talking about multiple species. We weren't the only ones around during the Ice Age. Neanderthals were already well established when our ancestors showed up, and they deserve far more credit than they usually get. Neanderthals were the original Ice Age survivors. They evolved in Europe and parts of Asia hundreds of thousands of years ago, living through glacial cycles long before modern humans ever left Africa. They weren't some brutish, primitive dead end. They were sophisticated, intelligent humans who had adapted incredibly well to glacial conditions. Their adaptations were truly brilliant. Consider their body structure. Neanderthals were short and stocky, with barrel chests and thick, heavy bones. The average male was only about 160 centimeters tall, but they were built like tanks, seriously muscular, with bones showing massive muscle attachment sites. This wasn't random. It was an adaptation to the cold. Shorter, stockier bodies have less surface area relative to their volume, meaning less heat loss. This is Bergmann's rule in action, the same principle that made Ice Age megafauna so large. In cold climates, compact bodies retain heat better, and their faces were distinctive, with large noses and wide nasal passages. This wasn't for aesthetics. Those big nasal cavities acted like built-in air conditioners, warming and humidifying the frigid, dry air before it reached the lungs. Breathing super-cold air repeatedly can damage lung tissue, so this was crucial. It's the same adaptation we see in woolly mammoths with their enlarged sinuses. Different species, same solution to the same problem. Convergent evolution at work. But physical adaptations only tell part of the story. Neanderthals had sophisticated culture and technology. They made complex stone tools using the Levallois technique, carefully preparing a core and then striking off flakes of predetermined shapes. This requires planning and mental visualization. You have to see the finished tool in your mind before you start working the stone. They also made wooden spears, carefully shaped and balanced, with tips hardened by fire. Some of these spears have been found preserved in German peat bogs, and they're beautifully crafted. And Neanderthals hunted big, dangerous game. We've found Neanderthal sites with bones of bison, reindeer, wild horses, even woolly rhinoceros and mammoth. These weren't scavenged carcasses. The bones show clear butchery marks made with stone tools while the meat was fresh. Neanderthals were actively hunting animals that could easily kill them if the hunt went wrong. That requires coordination, communication, planning, and courage. They used fire extensively and effectively, not just for warmth and cooking, but for making complex adhesives. Archaeologists have found Neanderthal tools with birch bark tar used to attach stone points to wooden handles. Making birch bark tar requires heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen at specific temperatures. This is a multi-step process that requires technical knowledge and careful control. You can't just stumble into figuring this out. They understood the process and could replicate it reliably. Even more impressive, Neanderthals had symbolic culture. They made ornamental objects, pierced shells, and eagle talons that were apparently worn as jewelry. They used pigments, possibly for body painting or decorating objects or cave walls, and they buried their dead, sometimes with what appear to be grave goods or in deliberate postures. There's a famous burial at Shanidar Cave in Iraq that includes evidence that might suggest flowers were placed in the grave, though that's still debated. I've often wondered about the moment when we became the only human species left. It's a strange thought, isn't it? That not so long ago, relatively speaking, we shared this planet. Neanderthals, for instance, were deeply thoughtful. The intentional burial of their dead proves that, and they even created art. In Spanish caves, I've seen the abstract geometric patterns and hand stencils they left behind, dating to a time when they were the sole occupants of that region. These are some of the earliest known examples of cave art, pushing back the timeline of symbolic behavior. And these markings weren't isolated incidents. Similar finds at multiple sites suggest a broader Neanderthal culture. So, why did they disappear? The last Neanderthals died out around 40,000 years ago, just as modern humans were spreading into Europe from Africa and the Middle East. The timing is, well, it's suspicious. Did we outcompete them, absorb them through interbreeding, or something else entirely? The genetic evidence tells a clear story. Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. If you're of European or Asian descent, you likely carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. It might not sound like much, but it proves our ancestors had children together. Those children survived and had their own children. Some Neanderthal genes are still with us today, affecting immune function, skin, hair, even our susceptibility to certain diseases. So, in a way, Neanderthals didn't completely vanish. They were absorbed. But as a distinct population with their own culture and identity, they didn't survive. Why? Demographics likely played a major role. Modern human populations seem to have been larger and more widespread. In any competition for resources, greater numbers usually win. Even if individual Neanderthals were as capable as individual modern humans, being outnumbered 10 to 1 would eventually lead to being swamped by the larger population. Modern humans also seem to have had technological advantages. While Neanderthals made excellent tools, we developed more diverse and specialized kits. We crafted fine bone needles for fitted clothing, offering better insulation than simple hides. We created fishing equipment like hooks and harpoons, expanding our food sources. The art and ornaments we produced were more prolific, hinting at complex social structures or better communication. Our trade networks were wider too. Materials found at modern human sites came from hundreds of kilometers away, evidence of extensive exchange. Neanderthal trade networks were more localized. Trade isn't just about goods, it's about information and social connections. Wider networks mean more shared ideas and innovations, accelerating cultural evolution and adaptation. Some researchers even believe modern humans had slightly better language abilities, allowing for more complex planning and coordination. Or perhaps our social structures were more effective at resource acquisition or raising children. These are subtle differences not easily visible in archaeological remains, but over generations, they could compound into significant advantages. Climate might have played a role as well. The late Ice Age was incredibly unstable, with rapid swings between cold and warm. Neanderthals, specialized for cold, stable conditions, might have struggled more with these rapid fluctuations. Modern humans, coming from Africa with its own climate variability, might have been more adaptable. But this is all speculative. What's clear is that by 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were gone, and modern humans were the only human species left in Europe. And we were spreading everywhere, adapting to every environment. By the end of the last glacial period, we had reached every continent except Antarctica, surviving the most extreme phase of the 100,000-year cycle. We developed an impressive array of technologies during the late Ice Age. Projectile weapons were a game changer. Early humans used thrusting spears, requiring close proximity to prey, dangerous when hunting mammoth. Then came the atlatl, a spear thrower that acts as a lever arm, dramatically increasing the throwing range and power. Suddenly, we could attack from tens of meters away, much safer. Later, probably between 20 and 30,000 years ago, in some regions, we invented the bow and arrow. This was huge. Arrows are faster and more accurate than atlatl darts. We could carry more ammunition and hunt smaller, faster animals more effectively. The bow might be one of the most important technological innovations in human history, fundamentally changing how we acquired food and defended ourselves. Hunting strategies also became more sophisticated. There's evidence of drive hunting, where groups would herd animals toward cliffs or into constructed traps. Sites with hundreds of bison or horses driven off cliffs and butchered. This requires serious coordination among large groups, scouts, drivers, people positioned at the cliff to finish off injured animals, butchers, all working together with precise timing. It's complex social behavior requiring communication and planning. Fishing also became important with the development of harpoons, fish hooks made from bone, and nets. We opened up aquatic resources those cave paintings from the Ice Age. When I first saw them, I was struck by how modern they felt. Not crude at all, but sophisticated, dynamic images of animals. It's clear those artists understood shading, perspective, and how to use the cave walls themselves to create three-dimensional effects. Food wasn't just about hunting mammoths. Not anymore. Fishing became a major source, especially in coastal and river areas, and far less risky. Coastal sites reveal intensive use of fish and shellfish, with shell middens representing thousands of meals. Clothing changed dramatically, too. Bone needles, appearing around 40,000 years ago, allowed for fitted clothing with sleeves and claws. I've tried just wrapping animal hides. It's not very effective. Fitted clothing traps body heat so much better. This let humans survive in colder regions and stay active even in winter. Shelter also evolved. Where wood was scarce, people built structures using mammoth bones and tusks as frameworks covered with hides. These mammoth bone houses have been found in Ukraine and Russia, using bones from dozens of mammoths, representing thousands of kilograms of material. These weren't temporary camps, but substantial dwellings where people invested serious effort into creating comfortable, long-term living spaces. And then there's the art. Beyond cave paintings, people carved figurines from ivory, bone, and stone. The Venus figurines, those stylized female forms found across Europe, date to this period, some with elaborate details like hairstyles or clothing carved into them. They made musical instruments, flutes carved from bird bones or mammoth ivory. Elaborate burials with grave goods, including thousands of ivory beads sewn onto clothing, have been found. One burial of children in Russia had so many beads that researchers estimated it would have taken thousands of hours to make them. These people valued symbolic expression enough to invest enormous time and effort. Why create art at all? Probably for many reasons. Some cave art might have been connected to hunting magic or spiritual rituals. Some figurines might have been religious or fertility symbols. Some art was probably just for aesthetic plea or social bonding. The point is, Ice Age humans weren't just focused on survival. They had rich inner lives, symbolic thinking, spiritual beliefs, and cultural traditions. They were fully modern, mentally and behaviorally, even though they lived in conditions we'd find incredibly harsh. Human populations during the Ice Age weren't huge, maybe just a few million worldwide, but they had spread across most habitable regions. They'd reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, crossing significant water gaps even during low sea levels. They'd spread throughout Asia and Europe, and critically, they'd made it to the Americas. The populating of the Americas is fascinating. During peak glaciation, when sea levels were low, the Bering land bridge connected Asia and North America. But Beringia wasn't just a narrow strip, it was a vast region, probably thousands of kilometers wide, with its own ecosystems. Humans crossed it, probably following game animals, entering a continent with no previous human population and megafauna that had never encountered human hunters. The timing is still debated. The oldest widely accepted sites in the Americas date to about 15 to 16,000 years ago, but there are controversial sites that might be older, suggesting people could have arrived as early as 20 to 30,000 years ago. Either way, once humans were in the Americas, they spread incredibly fast. Within just a few thousand years, there's evidence of human presence from Alaska to the southern tip of South America. That's an incredible migration speed. And remember, the American megafauna went extinct shortly after humans arrived. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, camels, all gone within a few thousand years of human appearance. The timing suggests humans played a major role. The Clovis people, with their distinctive spear points and apparent focus on hunting mammoths, have been particularly implicated, but it's complicated. Climate was changing rapidly at the same time. It's probably both factors working together. By the time the Holocene began 11,700 years ago, humans were the dominant large animal on multiple continents. We'd outlasted Neanderthals and other human species. We'd survived the wild climate swings of deglaciation. We'd adapted to every environment from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra. And we developed incredibly diverse cultures and technologies. Despite being one species genetically, humans showed cultural diversity that no other species has ever matched. This set the stage for what came next: the development of agriculture and the rise of civilization. But that's a different chapter in the story. The point is, the Ice Age and its 100,000-year cycle was the crucible that forged modern human behavior. The technological innovations, the social structures, the symbolic thinking all developed or were refined during the harsh conditions of glacial cycles. We are, in a very real sense, products of the Ice Age. Our success as a species was built on adaptations to a frozen world, and now that world is gone, melted away as the cycle shifted to its warm phase. I sometimes wonder if we're truly adapted to the world we live in now, or are we just carrying around evolutionary baggage from an ice age that ended millennia ago? It's a question that lingers in my mind. The 100,000-year cycle has shifted. The ice has melted. The megafauna are mostly gone, and we humans now occupy a world utterly different from what our ancestors knew for hundreds of thousands of years. We've entered the Holocene, our current interglacial period, and it's a time when everything changes for human societies. Around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas cold snap finally released its grip, and temperatures rose rapidly, stabilizing into conditions resembling those of today. The climate became warmer and wetter than it had been during the glacial period. Forests expanded massively, spreading across what had been cold grasslands and tundra. Sea levels continued their rise as the last of the major ice sheets melted, flooding coastlines and creating the geography we recognize today. The transformation was dramatic and relatively fast. For humans who had lived as hunter-gatherers, this shift presented both opportunities and challenges. Warmer temperatures meant longer growing seasons, more diverse vegetation, and a more predictable climate. But the megafauna they had hunted were disappearing. The massive herds of mammoth, bison, and horses that had been reliable food sources were either gone or on the brink of extinction. Humans had to adapt their subsistence strategies quickly or face dire consequences. In some regions, people turned heavily to fishing and gathering shellfish. Coastal sites from this period reveal enormous shell middens and fish bone deposits. The ocean was stable and productive, providing a reliable source of food. In other regions, people focused more on smaller game, like deer, rabbits, and birds, supplementing their diet with gathered nuts, seeds, roots, and berries. These smaller animals require different hunting techniques than megafauna. You can't drive deer off cliffs effectively. You need different tools, different strategies. But in a few special regions, something revolutionary happened. People started deliberately planting and cultivating wild plants. This was the dawn of agriculture, and it changed everything about human society. The earliest clear evidence of agriculture appears in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East around 11 to 10,000 years ago. People began cultivating wheat and barley, domesticating sheep and goats. In China, rice and millet cultivation began around 9,000 years ago. In Mesoamerica, maize was domesticated around the same time in multiple regions independently. Within just a few thousand years of each other, humans invented farming. Why did agriculture develop when it did? That's a question that has been debated endlessly. One theory points to population priz. During the Ice Age, human populations were kept relatively small by harsh conditions and limited food resources. But as the Holocene began and conditions improved, populations may have grown to the point where hunting and gathering couldn't support everyone. Agriculture produces more calories per unit of land than hunting and gathering, so it can support higher population densities. If your population outgrows your hunting territory, you either starve, migrate, or innovate. Some groups chose innovation. Another theory emphasizes climate stability. Agriculture requires planning for the future. You plant seeds and wait months for harvest. This only makes sense if you can reasonably predict that conditions will remain suitable for plant growth. During the wildly fluctuating climate of the late Ice Age, with events like the Younger Dryas, that wasn't a safe bet. But during the Holocene, climate became more stable and predictable. You could plant in spring and be reasonably confident summer would come and your crops would mature. This stability made agriculture viable in a way it hadn't been before. There's also a theory that the Younger Dryas specifically triggered agriculture in the Middle East. The idea is that hunter-gatherers in the Fertile Crescent had developed semi-sedentary lifestyles during the warm period before the Younger Dryas, living in villages and intensively harvesting wild grains. Then the Younger Dryas hit, and those wild grains became less productive. To maintain their lifestyles and avoid starvation, people started actively cultivating the grains, selecting for varieties that produced more food. When the Younger Dryas ended, they were already farming and just continued. Whatever triggered it, agriculture spread rapidly once it started, and it came with a massive package of changes to human society. You can't be nomadic and farm effectively. You need to stay in one place to tend crops and protect them from animals and thieves. So agriculture led to permanent settlements, villages that grew into towns and eventually cities. These settlements required new forms of social organization. Who controls the land? How do you store surplus food? How do you defend your settlement? How do you resolve disputes? Agriculture also changed human diets dramatically, and not always for the better. Hunter-gatherers typically had diverse diets with lots of protein and varied nutrients from many plant and animal sources. Early farmers ate mostly carbohydrates from a few grain crops, supplemented with whatever else they could grow or gather. Skeletons from early agricultural societies show signs of nutritional stress compared to hunter-gatherers. More cavities from all the starchy foods, shorter average stature, diseases associated with dietary deficiencies. Agriculture allowed population growth, but individual health often declined. Disease became a much bigger problem once humans started living in permanent settlements. When you're nomadic and moving frequently, your waste gets left behind, and diseases don't have time to build up. But in permanent villages, the rise of agriculture, it seems, was a double-edged sword. On one hand, high population densities, waste accumulation, contaminated water, and close contact with domestic animals created ideal breeding grounds for infectious diseases. I've often wondered about the sheer scale of suffering that must have accompanied those early epidemics. Many of the diseases that still plague us, measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, influenza, originated in domestic animals, jumping to humans once we began living in close proximity to livestock. Farming, in a way, made us more vulnerable, but agriculture also held an overwhelming advantage. It could support far more people per unit of land. A square kilometer of wheat fields could feed dozens, even hundreds. The same area of wild land might sustain only a handful of hunter-gatherers. This meant agricultural societies could grow much larger. More people meant more workers, more soldiers, more inventors, more of everything. And when these agricultural societies encountered hunter-gatherer groups, the farmers usually won simply through greater numbers, even if the hunter-gatherers were individually healthier or better warriors. Over millennia, agriculture spread across most of the world where the climate allowed. Sometimes this happened through the migration of farming peoples, displacing or absorbing hunter-gatherers. Other times, hunter-gatherers adopted farming from their agricultural neighbors. Either way, most humans transitioned from mobile hunting and gathering to settled farming, setting the stage for the rise of complex civilizations. Permanent settlements grew into cities. These cities required food from the surrounding agricultural areas, which led to the development of trade networks. Trade, in turn, necessitated record-keeping, leading to the independent invention of writing in multiple regions. Complex societies developed hierarchies, with rulers, priests, craftspeople, farmers, and slaves forming distinct social classes. Organized religion became more prominent, with monumental architecture like temples and pyramids built to honor gods or rulers. Specialized occupations emerged as some people focused full-time on pottery, metalworking, weaving, or administration rather than food production. The first civilizations arose in river valleys where agriculture was particularly productive. Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley in South Asia, the Yellow River in China. These civilizations developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, all the hallmarks of complex society. All of this unfolded within just a few thousand years after the end of the last ice age. The transformation from small, mobile hunter-gatherer bands to cities with tens of thousands of people is, when you think about it, incredibly rapid. But here's an important point. Even as these civilizations rose, hunter-gatherer societies continued to thrive in other parts of the world. Australia's Aboriginal peoples maintained their hunter-gatherer lifestyles for tens of thousands of years after agriculture was invented elsewhere. In the Americas, many groups remained hunter-gatherers, even as others developed agriculture and built cities. In Africa, groups like the San people hunted and gathered successfully until very recently, and some still do. Agriculture wasn't inevitable or universally adopted. It was one strategy among many, one that happened to be very successful at supporting large populations and complex societies, but not the only viable way to live. The ecological consequences of this Holocene transition were profound. It wasn't just about the extinction of megafauna. Forests expanded dramatically, changing countless ecosystems. Species adapted to open grasslands had to move, adapt, or go extinct. Cold-adapted species retreated northward or to higher elevations, while warm-adapted species expanded their ranges. The distribution of species across the planet shifted massively within just a few thousand years, and humans were increasingly shaping these ecosystems, often in ways we didn't fully appreciate until recently. Indigenous peoples around the world used fire as a landscape management tool, burning regularly to maintain open areas that attracted game animals or promoted the growth of useful plants. This burning had huge effects on vegetation patterns. What we often think of as natural, pristine ecosystems are, in many cases, actually anthropogenic, shaped by thousands of years of human fire management. In Australia, Aboriginal burning transformed large areas from dense forest to open woodland and grassland. In North America, Native American burning maintained vast prairies and savannas that might otherwise have been forested. When Europeans arrived and disrupted these burning practices, ecosystems often shifted dramatically. Forests grew in where they hadn't been for millennia. Fire-adapted species declined, while fire-sensitive species increased. The wilderness Europeans encountered wasn't pristine nature. It was often the result of thousands of years of active human management. The extinction of megafauna also had cascading ecological effects that we are still trying to fully understand. Mega-herbivores like mammoths weren't just eating plants. They were ecosystem engineers. They knocked down trees, maintained open areas, distributed nutrients through their dung, created trails and wallows. When they disappeared, these functions disappeared too. Some scientists believe forests expanded after the Ice Age, partly because there were no longer giant herbivores suppressing tree growth. There's even a hypothesis that megafauna extinction contributed to climate change. Large herbivores produce a lot of methane, a potent greenhouse gas, from their digestive systems. When megafauna populations crashed, methane emissions might have decreased significantly, and the transformation from open grasslands to forests changed the reflectivity of the land surface, affecting how much solar energy was absorbed versus reflected. The loss of the megafauna had far-reaching consequences, rippling through human societies. For millennia, we had relied on these massive creatures for survival. Their extinction wasn't just about the loss of a food source, it meant losing vital materials. I think of mammoth ivory used for tools, art, even construction. Hides provided clothing and shelter. Bones became needles, dwelling frameworks, necessities we suddenly had to replace. It's possible this disappearance forced us to innovate, to find new solutions, perhaps even accelerating the transition to agriculture in some regions. If your primary food source vanishes and hunting smaller game proves insufficient, the options narrow: starvation or a new strategy. Agriculture became that strategy for many. Those extinctions that marked the end of the Ice Age world may have inadvertently set us on the path toward modern civilization. The Holocene, the era we live in now, has been remarkably stable compared to the Pleistocene's wild climate swings. Yes, there have been warm and cold periods, droughts and floods, but nothing like the dramatic shifts of the Ice Age with its rapid warming and cooling events. This stability, I believe, was crucial for the development of civilizations. It's difficult to build cities and plan agriculture when the climate might drastically change within a generation. The Holocene's stability allowed us to make long-term plans and investments, building irrigation systems and monumental architecture that took decades, even centuries, to complete. It's important to remember that different parts of the world experienced the Holocene differently. The Sahara Desert, now a vast wasteland, was once green and wet. From about 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, increased monsoon activity brought more rain to North Africa. Rivers flowed where there's now only sand. Lakes filled valleys. Vegetation flourished. People lived throughout the region, herding cattle and developing agriculture. I've seen rock art from this period depicting hippos, giraffes, elephants, animals that seem impossibly out of place today. Then, around 5,000 years ago, the African monsoons weakened and the Sahara dried out relatively quickly. Within just a few centuries, the green Sahara transformed into the desert we know. This desertification forced populations to migrate, many moving to the Nile Valley, where water remained available. Some historians believe this migration and concentration along the Nile contributed to the development of ancient Egyptian civilization. Climate change driving human migration, driving civilization development. It's all interconnected. Similar stories played out elsewhere. The Middle East was relatively wet in the early Holocene, supporting agriculture and early civilizations. But droughts have repeatedly stressed or collapsed civilizations there. In Mesoamerica, droughts have been linked to the collapse of the Maya civilization. In the American Southwest, extended droughts forced the abandonment of settlements like Mesa Verde. Climate variability during the Holocene has been a constant factor shaping human history, even though the swings were mild compared to the Ice Age. And here we are now, roughly 11,700 years into the current interglacial period. Based on past interglacials, we should eventually slide back into glacial conditions at some point. Different models offer different predictions. Some suggest we have thousands of years before the next glaciation begins. Others think tens of thousands of years. The orbital cycles are complex, and their effects don't always line up predictably. But there's a massive wild card now. Human activity is affecting global climate on a scale that might override the natural cycles entirely. We've increased atmospheric carbon dioxide from the natural interglacial level of about 280 parts per million to over 420 parts per million. That's a 50% increase in just a couple of centuries. The ice core records going back 800,000 years show nothing like this. We're in completely uncharted territory. And this brings us to the big question: what happens next? It's here where things get really interesting and, honestly, a bit scary. We've spent this whole time talking about how the 100,000-year cycle has controlled Earth's climate for millions of years, creating ice ages and shaping the evolution of life, including humans. But now, for the first time in the history of this cycle, one species has the power to override it, and that species is us. Some scientists believe we've already delayed or even canceled the next glaciation. The extra carbon dioxide we pumped into the atmosphere is warming the planet, making it unlikely that northern hemisphere summers will be cool enough to allow ice sheet formation, even when the orbital cycles shift toward glacial conditions. We might have prevented the next ice age from ever happening. Sounds good, right? Nobody wants kilometers of ice covering Canada and Scandinavia again. But the problem is, we're not just preventing the next ice age, we're warming the planet way beyond normal interglacial conditions, and we're doing it incredibly fast. Let's talk about what we've learned from studying ice age cycles and why it matters right now. First, and most importantly, the climate system has tipping points. It's not linear or gradual. You can push the system for a while and see only small changes, then suddenly cross a threshold, and boom, rapid dramatic shifts happen. The Younger Dryas is the perfect example. Gradual warming, then catastrophic freshwater flooding, then abrupt climate reversal within decades. The system flipped states faster than human lifetimes. We're seeing similar threshold behavior today in multiple parts of the climate. Ice sheets don't melt in a way that is uniform or predictable. I've learned that they can remain stable for long stretches, only to suddenly accelerate their melting when they pass certain critical thresholds. Similarly, ocean circulation patterns, such as the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, can gradually weaken, but then potentially shut down with relative speed. And permafrost, frozen for millennia, can abruptly thaw, unleashing greenhouse gases that only intensify the warming. These aren't smooth, linear processes. They're systems where even a small additional press can trigger a large response. And the unsettling truth is we're pushing multiple systems toward their tipping points all at once. Arctic sea ice, for instance, is declining dramatically. Since satellite measurements began in the 1970s, the minimum extent in summer has plummeted by about 40%. Some models even suggest we could see ice-free Arctic summers within decades. And it's vital to remember those feedback loops. Ice reflects sunlight, while ocean water absorbs it. So less ice means more heat absorption, which leads to more warming, and then more ice loss. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. The Greenland ice sheet is losing mass at an accelerating rate around 250 billion tons per year, according to recent measurements. Greenland holds enough ice to raise global sea levels by about 7 meters, if it were to completely melt. While no one anticipates a complete melt anytime soon, even losing a fraction of it over the coming centuries would have a massive impact on coastlines worldwide. Once major melting begins, Feedback effects make it incredibly difficult to stop. Exposed, darker rock absorbs more heat. Meltwater lubricates the ice base, causing it to flow faster. And warm ocean water gets underneath, melting the ice from below. All of these are positive feedbacks, amplifying the initial change. The West Antarctic ice sheet is particularly concerning. Much of it rests on bedrock below sea level, and warm ocean water is already making its way underneath, causing melting. Some scientists believe that major portions of it might be committed to collapse over the coming centuries, even if we were to halt warming today. If that happens, we're looking at 3 to 5 meters of sea level rise. That would completely reshape coastlines around the globe and displace hundreds of millions of people. The carbon cycle is also being disrupted in ways that mirror the Ice Age cycles, but reversed and at a much faster pace. During glacial periods, carbon dioxide levels dropped to around 180 to 200 parts per million. During interglacial periods, they rose to about 280 to 300 parts per million. This swing of roughly 100 parts per million took tens of thousands of years, driven by natural ocean and vegetation processes. But in just over a century, we've increased carbon dioxide by over 140 parts per million. We're replicating the entire range of the natural cycle in a tiny fraction of the time. And we're blowing past natural interglacial levels, venturing into territory Earth hasn't seen for millions of years. The last time carbon dioxide levels were this high was probably during the Pliocene epoch, around 3 million years ago. Back then, temperatures were several degrees warmer than today. Sea levels were 15 to 25 meters higher, and the Arctic was forested instead of ice-covered. That's the trajectory we're on if we don't change course. The rate of change is just as important as the magnitude. Ecosystems can adapt to gradual changes over thousands of years. Species migrate, evolution selects for new traits, and ecological communities reassemble. But when change occurs in decades or centuries, there's simply no time for gradual adaptation. Species either move fast enough or they face extinction. We're already observing range shifts in thousands of species, with plants flowering earlier, animals moving toward the poles or up mountains, and ocean species shifting to cooler waters. Some species are adapting successfully, while others aren't. And sadly, we're likely headed for another extinction wave. Perhaps not as dramatic as the megafauna extinctions of the past, but significant nonetheless. Current extinction rates are already elevated above background levels, and climate change is adding another major stressor on top of habitat loss and pollution. Here's something that keeps many scientists up at night. During Ice Age cycles, carbon dioxide changes were a feedback, not a forcing. Orbital variations altered sunlight distribution, which affected temperature. Temperature changes then affected ocean chemistry and vegetation, which in turn changed atmospheric carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide then amplified the temperature changes. It was a feedback loop within the system, responding to external astronomical forcing. But what we're doing is fundamentally different. We're directly forcing carbon dioxide changes by burning fossil fuels. This is direct forcing, not feedback. And all those natural feedbacks that amplified carbon dioxide changes during Ice Age cycles are still operating. They're amplifying the changes we're causing. We're pushing on a system with built-in amplifiers and we don't fully understand all of them or where the thresholds lie. Permafrost is a huge wild card. There's around 1,500 billion tons of organic carbon stored in frozen Arctic soils. That's roughly twice as much carbon as currently in the atmosphere. As the Arctic warms, permafrost thaws, and microbes start decomposing that organic matter, releasing carbon dioxide and methane. It's a classic feedback loop. Warming causes thawing. Thawing releases greenhouse gases, and greenhouse gases cause more warming. How quickly this happens is uncertain, but the potential for permafrost to become a major additional carbon source is both real and frightening. The ocean has absorbed about 90% of the extra heat trapped by greenhouse gases so far. This has slowed atmospheric warming, but at the cost of warming the ocean itself. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen. We're already seeing expanding dead zones where oxygen levels have dropped too low to support most life. Marine organisms are stressed by warming, acidification from dissolved carbon dioxide, and oxygen loss simultaneously. Coral reefs are being devastated by repeated bleaching events. These ecosystems, which support enormous biodiversity, are collapsing. The climate is complicated, counterintuitive. I find myself returning to that simple truth again and again. Global warming, paradoxically, could cause regional cooling in some areas. It's happened before. The AMO, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, shows signs of weakening. The data is noisy and doesn't stretch back far enough for real certainty, but several lines of evidence hint that it might be slowing down. If it weakens significantly, or even shuts down entirely, it could cause regional cooling in parts of Europe. It's what happened during the Younger Dryas. What do we do with this knowledge, this understanding of the 100,000-year cycle? It teaches us that Earth's climate is incredibly sensitive to even relatively small changes. Those orbital variations that trigger ice ages, they represent tiny shifts in seasonal sunlight distribution. Yet, combined with feedback loops, they're enough to tip the system from one state to another. And we're applying forcing that is much larger and much faster than those orbital variations. The response will be substantial. The only question is how substantial and on what time scale. Climate has momentum. Ice sheets take thousands of years to grow, but they can collapse much faster. Once major melting begins, stopping it becomes incredibly difficult. Ocean circulation changes can be just as hard to reverse. Some of the changes we're causing are essentially irreversible on human timescales. Even if all emissions stopped tomorrow, temperatures would remain elevated for centuries as the ocean and atmosphere slowly find a new equilibrium. Sea level would continue rising for centuries, even millennia, as ice sheets keep responding to the warming already in the pipeline. It's uncomfortable to think about, I know. We've probably already committed to significant changes, even with aggressive emission reductions. Some warming, some sea level rise, some ecosystem disruption is already baked in. The real question is how much more we add. Every bit of additional warming makes things worse. Every tenth of a degree matters when dealing with systems that have tipping points. The paleoclimate record teaches us that rapid climate change is incredibly hard on societies. Climate changes at the end of the Ice Age contributed to megafauna extinctions and forced major shifts in human subsistence. Droughts during the Holocene have toppled civilizations, and those were natural variations, changes over which societies had no control. We're causing changes faster and potentially larger than those natural variations. With over 8 billion people to feed and house, many in areas vulnerable to climate change, the implications are staggering. Coastal cities face flooding from sea level rise. Agricultural regions face shifting rainfall patterns and more extreme weather. Water resources are stressed by changing precipitation and glacial melt. Tropical regions could see temperatures exceeding human survivability thresholds for outdoor work during heat waves. Island nations could literally disappear. The humanitarian implications are enormous and unequally distributed. Those who contributed least to causing climate change are often the most vulnerable to its effects. But understanding the problem is the first step toward addressing it. We know more about climate now than ever before. We can see changes happening in real time with satellites and monitoring. We can model future scenarios with increasing accuracy. And we have technologies available that could dramatically reduce emissions if deployed at scale. Solar and wind are now cost competitive with fossil fuels in many places. Electric vehicles are becoming mainstream. Energy storage is improving. Carbon capture is being developed, though it's not yet proven at the necessary scale. The challenge isn't really technological anymore. It's political, economic, and social. Getting 8 billion people to coordinate on emission reductions, equitably distributing costs and benefits, navigating competing interests. That's the hard part. Climate change is the ultimate tragedy of the commons. Individual actors benefit from burning fossil fuels, but everyone suffers the consequences. Solving it requires collective action at a scale humanity has never achieved. Some people feel despair. The problem seems too big, changes too slow, obstacles too numerous. I understand that feeling, but humans have navigated existential challenges before. We survived the Ice Age through adaptation and innovation. We transitioned from hunting megafauna to agriculture, fundamentally transforming our relationship with the planet. We've overcome diseases, expanded lifespans, created technologies that would seem like magic to our ancestors. We're not helpless. We're just facing a problem requiring unprecedented coordination. The 100,000-year cycle will eventually resume, assuming we don't permanently alter it. The orbital mechanics haven't changed. Naturally, Earth would eventually slide back into glacial conditions tens of thousands of years from now. But we're writing a new chapter, one where human activity is a major climate driver, not just a responder. We're affecting the planet on a scale comparable to the astronomical forces that controlled climate for millions of years. No species has ever had this influence. It's both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Future geologists studying sediments millions of years from now will see a clear marker. They'll see isotope ratios reflecting massive carbon combustion, extinction signatures, novel materials like plastics and concrete in the sediment. They'll recognize that something unprecedented happened during this brief moment. Whether they'll also see evidence that we successfully navigated the crisis, that's still open. The answer depends on what we do in the coming decades. The cycle reminds us that climate is dynamic, sensitive to forcing, full of feedbacks and tipping points. It's not a stable, unchanging background. It's an active system responding to inputs. For millions of years, those inputs were natural. Now, we're adding a new input, and the system is responding. We're living through something unique. In all of Earth's 4.5 billion years, never before has a single species understood the global climate system while simultaneously altering it. We hold knowledge and power unlike anything any organism has ever possessed. What we choose to do with that will determine Earth's trajectory for thousands, even millions of years. The Ice Age cycles have shown us how resilient life truly is. Earth has weathered dramatic climate shifts, and life has always found a way to survive, adapt, and thrive. It survived the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. It survived ice ages. It will survive this too. The real question is whether human civilization as we know it will thrive, or will we face massive disruptions that could have been avoided if we had only acted with foresight. I began this exploration by talking about the mystery of the 100,000-year cycle and how scientists patiently solved it. That same scientific community is now sounding the alarm about anthropogenic climate change, using the very same methods that revealed the Ice Age cycles to us. If we trust the science that explained the past, shouldn't we also trust it when it predicts the future? It's clear we're pushing the system incredibly hard. We will see significant responses, and the window for avoiding the worst outcomes is closing rapidly. The Ice Age taught our ancestors the importance of being adaptable and innovative. That's in our DNA. We can use those traits to navigate the challenge we've created, but it requires collective and quick action. The climate system has momentum and time lags. Actions we take today won't show their full effects for decades. But inaction today commits us to changes that will unfold for centuries to come. Every year we delay makes the eventual response harder and more disruptive. So, where does that leave us? We are 11,700 years into an interglacial period that should eventually end. We are armed with an understanding of how climate works, and we are actively changing it faster than natural processes typically do. The 100,000-year cycle that shaped human evolution is now being overridden by human activity. We've become a geological force. The only question is whether we use that power wisely or recklessly. The answer will determine what planet future generations inherit and whether they'll see us as ancestors who rose to the challenge or as a cautionary tale of a species that understood the problem but failed to act. The clock is ticking. The cycle that sustained life for millions of years is still operating in the background. But for the first time, it might not matter because, for the first time, one of the species it created has the power to override it. And what we do with that power in the next few decades will determine not just our future, but the future of countless other species sharing this planet with us. The Ice Age is over. The question is, what comes next? And unlike our ancestors, who just had to survive the cycle, we have the power to shape it. That's both an incredible responsibility and an incredible opportunity. It's time to see what we do with it.